Episode 19, The Year of the Five Emperors, 190 to 199 AD. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. In any good sequel, the stakes need to be raised. More action, bigger consequences. Well, this decade, the Roman world will do its best to take things to a whole nother level. Remember the year of the four emperors? Back in 69 AD? That was nothing. How about the year of the five emperors? Now we're talking. Civil war returns to the Roman stage as the Nerva-Antonine dynasty is toppled. Last decade set the stage for the regime change. We mostly stayed in the capital, observing the chaotic and corrupt politics that swept through while Commodus cavorted. Outside of the palace, the Senate, the army, and the public grew increasingly discontent. An air of anxiety and tension covered the Roman world, like the still before a thunderstorm. This decade, the lightning strikes, the thunder booms, and the rain starts to fall. As we begin to weather the storm, I'm going to give you a guiding light by spoiling the ending for you. Septimius Severus will come out on top. Before we move on, though, this is your final reminder to send in questions to 202decades@gmail.com regarding anything from the 2nd century. After this episode, we'll hit pause, answer some questions, and look around at the Western world more broadly. And as always, if you'd like to support the show, you can become a Patreon member. There you'll get member-exclusive content, access to episodes 2 days early, and a chance to join the comments for each episode. One-time donations are also very much appreciated. Thanks for your support. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1, The Last Days of Commodus. Part 2, The Five Emperors. Part 3, Civil Wars. Part 4, Another Parthian War. Part 5, Who was Severus? Part 1, The Last Days of Commodus. Last time, we saw the fall of two prominent advisors who administered the empire in lieu of Commodus. This decade, his most recent praetorian prefect, Cleander, will meet a similar fate. In the spring of 190, Rome was suffering through a famine. The fleets had failed to transport adequate supplies to the capital, and the grain dole ran empty. The shortages were bad enough on their own, but our sources blame Cleander and his appointed grain commissioner for skimming too much off the top for personal profit. A general murmuring of discontentment filled the streets. During a chariot race in April of 190, the public's dissatisfaction spilled out into the open. As the 7th race of the day was about to begin, a few hungry children ran out onto the track and began shouting slogans condemning Cleander, blaming him for their empty stomachs. The crowds took up these angry chants, and a mob soon departed from the Circus Maximus, looking for the emperor. Their opinion of Commodus was still high. Surely he would deliver them justice. Cleander caught wind of what was happening and sent some soldiers to stop the crowds. Scuffles took place and a few demonstrators were killed. The people weren't deterred, though. Their anger was only incensed by this violence. As they approached the Quintilian suburb where Commodus was staying, his concubine, Marcia, brought him word of what was going on. The mob was near. Commodus was spooked. Like with Sauterus and Pertinax, he proved himself unfaithful yet again, and in his fear, he ordered Cleander and Cleander's son be killed. So, Cleander, the chamberlain and praetorian prefect, was quickly slain and his body thrown to the mob. In their mixed anger and exuberance, they mutilated his body and threw it into the Tiber River. The cowardice of Commodus contrasted wildly with the image of Hercules, who he presented himself as. More and more, the emperor portrayed himself as a manifestation of divinity. He commissioned statues around the empire of himself wearing the skin of the Nemean lion and carrying the club of Hercules. He even added this to his name, addressing the Senate on the rare occasion as the Emperor Caesar Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus Augustus Pius Felix Sarmaticus Germanicus Maximus Britannicus, pacifier of the whole earth, invincible, the Roman Hercules, Pontifex Maximus, holder of the tribunation authority for the 18th time, imperator for the 8th time, consul for the 7th time, father of his country, to consuls, praetors, tribunes, and the fortunate Commodian Senate. Greeting. Phew, a stunning display of megalomania. He calls the Senate the Commodian Senate because by this point he has renamed Rome itself to Commodiana, a name which didn't quite stick. You can imagine how the senatorial class felt about these odd and egoistic changes. Worse yet, Commodus seemed to be getting worse over time, competing, in quotation marks, in the arena more and making himself out to be a god more and humiliating and attacking the Senate more. His lack of dignity had surpassed even Nero. As the year 192 drew to a close, Commodus planned a spectacle for the New Year celebrations. It was customary for the emperor to make an appearance, coming out of the imperial palace to crowds of onlookers. But Commodus told close confidants, including his Praetorian prefect Laetus and his mistress Marcia, that this year he planned to change things up. Instead of making his appearance outside the palace, he would come out of a gladiatorial barracks. He would greet the crowds as both a consul and a gladiator, dressed in armor, not the imperial purple. His confidence begged him not to go through with these plans, but Commodus dismissed them in anger. Later that day, the last day of 192, Marcia stumbled upon a list of people to be executed the next day, written in Commodus's own handwriting. Her name, as well as Laetus and Eclectus, his new chamberlain, topped the list. Marcia rushed to Laetus and Eclectus and showed them the tablet with the list. There was no time to delay. The three quickly made plans to kill Commodus. Poison was their first choice. Marcia assured them she could deliver this poison. That afternoon, when Commodus returned from a bath, Marcia poured him a glass of wine and slipped in the poison. Commodus drained the cup without noticing what had been done. Immediately, he became drowsy and then slumped asleep in his chair. The conspirators cleared out the room, brushing off concerns by reminding them of the exhaustion Commodus must have felt after his fighting in the arena and his warm bath. Now alone with the sedated emperor, the three conspirators waited for his breathing to slow. He was quiet for a moment, but instead of a soft and peaceful exit from the world stage, Commodus began to violently vomit. What if he threw up all of his poison and lived? With their names on tomorrow's execution list, it was a risk they couldn't take. They sent for a young wrestler named Narcissus and promised him a big reward if he finished the job. Narcissus agreed. He grabbed the emperor by the neck and strangled him until Commodus was dead. This impromptu response to their impending deaths had left them no time to plan for what came next. The body needed to be removed before anyone else stumbled upon the scene. They wrapped his body up in linens, called in 2 loyal slaves, and had them carry his body out, right past the Praetorians who guarded the palace. But now what? The conspirators discussed making an announcement, claiming that Commodus had died from a stroke. They didn't want to leave the choice of who the next emperor would be up to others, though. They wanted to decide. The three selected someone completely the opposite of Commodus. An elder statesman who could restore dignity, order, and sanity to the imperial administration. They chose Pertinax. Part 2: The Five Emperors. What I've just related, the story of how Marcia, Laetus, and Eclectus killed Commodus and spontaneously chose Pertinax to be his successor, is told by both Cassius Dio and by Herodian. However, there are a few details that raise suspicions. This might not be the whole story. When Pertinax was contacted by the three conspirators, he claimed he didn't want to become emperor. Instead, after he was offered the job, he approached Pompeianus, the now very old advisor to Marcus Aurelius, and offered the position to him. But hold on one second. The last we heard from Pompeianus, he had left Rome and retired from public life after his wife was executed for trying to assassinate the emperor. And now he just happens to be back in the capital on the night of Commodus's death? Pretty convenient, if you ask me. Almost like it was all premeditated. It seems more likely that Pompeianus had been called in, and that Pertinax offering him the emperorship was part of a required humility performance. Maybe Pertinax participated more in the death of Commodus than our ancient historians let on. After Pompeianus had played his part, Pertinax was hastily brought before the Praetorians. Perhaps they were still rubbing their eyes, and the news that Commodus was dead hadn't quite sunk in yet. Under their urging from their prefect, Laetus, the Praetorians half-heartedly acclaimed Pertinax as emperor. They were more surprised than pleased at the whole sequence of events. The last stop on the acclamation tour of Rome was to the Senate House. Pertinax was thrust before them, and against his claims not to want the role, the Senate proclaimed him the new emperor, the new princeps, the new Augustus. Of course, his denials were just another part of the image he was crafting of the reluctant and restrained ruler. So, on the 1st of January, 193, Pertinax became the new Augustus. Let's get a few facts straight about him. As you've heard from the title of this section, though, with 5 emperors in a single year, we won't have time to go too in-depth. Nevertheless, a brief biography. Pertinax was born the son of a freedman. He served in the legions during the Parthian War of the 160s and later became an assistant to Pompeianus during the Marcomannic Wars. In the military, he earned a reputation for excellence. He soon became a senator and served as a suffect consul in 175. His meteoric rise was blunted by trouble caused by the administration of Commodus. In the 180s, he was forced out of public life by Pertinax. Once Pertinax was gone, though, in 185, Pertinax rejoined public life, but was stuck cleaning up the old Praetorian prefect's mess. He was sent to Britain to quell the unrest of soldiers in the late 180s, part of that wave of desertions kicked off by Pertinax's scheming. Despite his reputation and his prior stint on the island, he failed to earn the soldiers' respect. While trying to tame their mutiny, he was attacked by a legion. His bodyguards were killed, and he was left for dead. He survived, though, and escaped Britannia. Obviously, after this, he had to resign his post. This singular failure didn't ruin his career or his reputation, though. He was soon reassigned to high positions, first serving as proconsul in Africa for 2 years, and then on the eve of Commodus's assassination as the urban prefect of Rome. He was well liked and respected by the Senate for his temperance, discipline, and surely his connection to the prior regime. Now that Commodus was dead, the Senate eagerly voted to make him, posthumously, an enemy of the state. They tore down his statues and condemned his memory. Pertinax was more respectful to Commodus, likely due to loyalty to the dead emperor's father. But he found his own way to get revenge on Commodus. Through the first months of 193, Pertinax wasted no time rolling back the foolishnesses of Commodus. He recalled many noble families who had fled or been exiled from Rome. He ended the egregious taxes Commodus had levied and turned to austerity. His reforms were needed for financial stability, but they were tough pills to swallow. Instead of slow-rolling them patiently, he hurriedly pushed the reforms through, frustrating many. No one likes their special programs being trimmed. First, he alienated the poor by trying to reform the alimentus system, the welfare program supporting poor children in Italy. It was being abused. These cuts, together with cutting back on Commodus's extravagant spending on spectacles in the Colosseum, saved the state money, but the people quickly labeled him a stingy penny pincher. His monetary reforms were necessary but painful, like going to the dentist when you have a toothache, and the Romans were not happy about the root canal they were receiving. As I mentioned last time, the silver content of the Roman currency had fallen to less than 75% under Commodus. Inflation was rising everywhere, and Pertinax took the restrained step of rebasing the currency. He increased the silver content back up to 87%, adding him to a very short list of emperors who implemented sound economic strategy. Of course, this revaluing of the currency meant that there were fewer sesterces to pass around. The group most upset by all of these reforms were the Praetorians. Never mind that their prefect Laetus had picked the emperor, they were unhappy with Pertinax's attempts to reel them in. They had expected a generous donative when he came to power, and as February turned to March of 193, the Guard had only received half of what they were expecting. Pertinax refused to pay the rest. Worse, he tried to implement stricter discipline on them. Under Commodus, the discipline had been lax, the pay good. What had been a cush job suddenly became a great deal more rigid. The Praetorians began to murmur. Hypocritically, Laetus himself stoked their discontent. He, too late, discovered that he could not rule over the decisions of this emperor as his predecessors had done with Commodus. Their murmuring turned to plotting. Pertinax had to go. In early March, while the emperor was out of town inspecting grain shipments coming in to the port of Ostia, the Praetorians attempted a coup. They tried to acclaim a young senator named Falco while Pertinax was out of town. But catching wind of the revolts, he rushed back to the palace, arrested Falco, and secured his own position. Pertinax showed grace to Falco and let him live, but several of the Praetorian officers were executed. The rest of them were left unsatisfied. A few weeks later, on the 28th of March, the Praetorians attempted a more direct assault on the emperor. About 300 of the guard rushed the gates of the palace and broke in. Servants came to Pertinax and urged him to flee. Instead, Pertinax met the assailants head-on and tried to reason with them. His bravery, dignity, and appeal to their oaths paused their anger for a moment. However, all it took was one unabashed Praetorian striking him to break the spell. Many others quickly joined in, and Pertinax lay dead on the floor. 87 days after coming to power, the first of the 5 emperors was dead. Following his murder, Pertinax was honored by our ancient historians and the general senatorial class. He had tried to do the right thing, make the state financially stable, and tame the Praetorians, even if he acted too rashly. The speed was all wrong, but the trajectory was right. Cassius Dio says, "He failed to comprehend, though a man of wide practical experience, that one cannot with safety reform everything at once, and that the restoration of a state, in particular, requires both time and wisdom." Some of the glowing respect he receives from our sources, though, was applied in retrospect, holding up his memory in comparison to who came next. Who actually came next was not decided by the Senate, but by the Praetorians. As we will see more and more, Rome was becoming ruled by the sword before the law. rumor of Pertinax's death spread through the city. Already in the Praetorian camp was the urban prefect, Sulpicianus, who had been sent there by Pertinax, his son-in-law, to try to quell the guards' unrest. Rather than fleeing, he hung around. He was an ambitious man and realized that if he offered the guard the right deal, he could find himself in the imperial purple. He was in the right place at the right time. While he was bargaining with the Praetorians, another man had run to the camp and was just outside. This was Didius Julianus, who most recently had served as proconsul of Africa. Standing outside the gate, he began shouting his own offers to the Praetorians. Now, with two candidates, the bidding war began. Messengers ran back and forth, informing each man how high the other had raised the stakes. Sulpicianus, inside the camp itself, seemed likely to win out when he hit the pleasing sum of 20,000 sesterces per member of the guard. But Julianus, hearing this new sum, upped the ante by a large number, increasing his own offer to 25,000 sesterces. The Praetorians were overjoyed at this offer, and partly fearing that Sulpicianus would avenge their murder of his daughter's husband, they accepted Julianus into the camp and acclaimed him as emperor. As evening fell, Didius Julianus marched to the Senate house, surrounded by the Praetorians, carrying their banners and torches. The senators were summoned. They all had heard how the empire had been auctioned off. They hated Julianus, but feared the guard. Refusing to appear would only increase their danger, so they gathered together. Pushing through the heavily armed guard who surrounded the building, they entered and were met by a speech of Julianus. The gist of his argument was that he was the most fit to rule, so he appeared before them alone. It wasn't lost on the Senate, though, that there were hundreds of armed Praetorians just outside. Our source, Cassius Dio, himself a senator, was among those who steeled themselves and reluctantly proclaimed him as Augustus. The senators had to bite their tongues and hide their scowls. The public, in their numbers and anonymity, hid nothing of their disgust at the actions of Didius Julianus and the Praetorians. Shortly after his ascension, Julianus approached the Senate house to make a sacrifice to Janus. But the crowds stood in his path and shouted at him that he was a murderer and a stealer of the empire. He tried to calm them by promising them money, his signature move. But the people were offended by this and only pressed in and shouted louder. The new emperor ordered the guard to slay the shouters nearest to him. Many were wounded or killed. The crowds were more upset now than ever. They continued to resist. Many grabbed what weapons they could gather and occupied the Circus Maximus for a night and a day, all the time shouting for the legions to come and remove this false emperor. The name they called upon most specifically and most often was Pessinnius Niger, the governor of Syria. News of Pertinax's death and the people's pleas disseminated from Rome to all corners of the empire. 3 governors in particular heard the call and were eager to take action. Pessinnius Niger of Syria, Clodius Albinus of Britannia, and Septimius Severus of Pannonia. These 3 contenders for the throne were foretold in the celestial bodies, if you believe Cassius Dio. As Julianus offered the sacrifice of entrance in front of the Senate house, 3 bright stars appeared surrounding the sun. The people whispered it was a sign of Julianus's doom. Let's give the situations of each of these 3 governors, starting in the east. Niger, as governor of Syria, took pride in the people of Rome's calls for his aid. He had his legions declare him emperor and set about securing control of the east. He began with 3 legions under his immediate control, but soon added to that the legions of Arabia, Petraea, Cappadocia, and Egypt. Egypt itself was the jewel in his possessions. a cash machine, and potentially a tool to subdue Rome. Limiting the grain flow to the capital could be used to stir up unrest against the emperor there. Most of Niger's allies were on the eastern side of the empire. He did have one foothold in Europe, though, at Byzantium, the future site of Constantinople and modern Istanbul. An ally of Niger named Acelius Aemilianus, the proconsul of Asia in western Anatolia, rushed the short distance from there to the city. After securing Egypt and the Levant, Niger himself made his way to Byzantion, a stronghold and strategic location from which he could strike west or defend the east. Closer to Rome, the legions of Pannonia declared Lucius Septimius Severus Geta as emperor 12 days after the death of Pertinax. Julianus had already begun to prepare to face Niger's army after hearing the crowds clamor for him, but he was not ready to battle Severus. The governor of Pannonia quickly secured the support of the other legions along the Danube. His army was larger than Niger's. At least 10 legions, perhaps as many as 16, pledged their loyalty to him. Wasting no time, Septimius Severus began his march on Rome. The last challenger for the empire was Albinus in Britain. His 3 legions with him in Britannia declared him emperor, and it seemed plausible that the Rhine legions might declare for him as well. Stuck between black and white, Niger and Albinus, Severus chose to mollify one of his flanks so he could focus on the other. He sent a messenger to Albinus and offered him the title of Caesar, assuring him that he would have a place in the post-Julianus world, either sharing in power or as Severus's heir. Albinus agreed to the arrangement, threw his support behind Severus, and bided his time. As the steady tide of Severus's advance grew ever nearer, Julianus prepared for the coming battle. He incited the Senate to declare Septimius Severus an enemy of the state. The Severan army crossed the Alps and entered Italy, each town celebrating his coming and hailing him as Augustus. He seized Ravenna without a fight and took possession of its Adriatic fleet. Within a month, Severus and the Danube legions were only 70 miles from Rome. Inside the city, Julianus was in a bit of a panic. As he desperately tried to scrape together an army, Rome became a chaotic mustering ground for soldiers, horses, and even elephants. He tried to prepare the Praetorians to stand against the Danube legions, but instilling the Praetorians with discipline, which Pertinax had paid with his life trying to do, would not come easily. As a final strategy, the emperor attempted to stop Severus's approach. But every senator he sent joined the enemy camp, and every detachment of soldiers sent out to stop him defected to the enemy ranks. Severus, in the meantime, had sent letters to the guard promising them clemency if they maintained the peace and handed over the killers of Pertinax. The spoiled Praetorians were growing tired of training and worried for their futures. It didn't matter how much money Julianus promised them if they ended up dead on the battlefield. They approached one of the consuls for the year and expressed that they were done with this emperor. The consul called together the Senate in a secret location, and without the Praetorians to fear any longer, they voted Julianus an enemy of the state, hailed Severus as the new Roman emperor, and belatedly bestowed divine honors on Pertinax. On June 2nd of 193, Julianus, abandoned by all, was found and killed inside the palace. His bidding had bought him just 66 days as emperor. Septimius Severus had some business to attend to before entering Rome. The Praetorians who had participated in the murder of Pertinax were put to death. The rest of the Praetorian Guard were summoned out of the city and ordered to appear before him. Again promising them clemency, they were commanded to come without their weapons. When the guard arrived, though, they were surrounded by the legions, stripped of their horses and gear, and forever exiled from Rome. A detachment of his army had secretly gone ahead into the city to seize their weapons. Severus was determined not to reign with the threat of the Praetorians hanging over him, and in one move he had eliminated them as a threat. Whereas the old Praetorian Guard had for the past 2 centuries been made up of Italians, Severus would make his own new Praetorian Guard. The new Praetorians, hand-selected by Severus for their loyalty, were men of the provinces, a shift reflective of the relative rise of the periphery. Emperor Septimius Severus now entered Rome, not alone or in peace, but at the head of his army. This blatantly broke all the norms and violated the pomerium, the sacred circle around the city within which weapons were forbidden. The tradition had, of course, been violated before, but never so flippantly or blatantly. A shift reflective of how Severus intended to rule. Of course, Severus didn't advertise his reliance on military might. He entered the city, yes, flanked by his soldiers, but otherwise in the tradition of so many good emperors before him, stopping to make a sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter, and then making a speech to the Senate. Here he spoke mildly and offered promises of restoring senatorial honor and order. No senators would be put to death without approval of the body, he said. He assured them he was reintroducing senatorial rule. He would imitate the just and dutiful rule of Marcus Aurelius. With this speech, he won the favor of the senators. The contrast with Julianus and Commodus was clear. Already beloved for ridding them of Julianus, Severus further ingratiated himself to the populace by giving them a gift of cash and hosting games. As fast as he had arrived, the new emperor left. He spent only a month in Rome. Gathering his army and his fleet, he set off for the east. Pertinax Niger had received news of Severus's arrival and activity in Rome, but he wasn't going to lay down his sword just because someone else got to the capital first. The year of the 5 emperors was half over, but the violence was only just getting started. Part 3. Civil Wars. Pertinax Niger and Septimius Severus were going to war over who would control the Roman Empire. It was West versus East. Each had their advantages. Severus had the larger army and controlled Rome. Niger could sit back and play defense while he collected the riches of the East and put pressure on Severus by blocking Egyptian grain fleets from feeding the capital. Geography was the key to this defensive strategy, and the city of Byzantium was the linchpin. It stood as a bulwark at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, guarding the narrow crossings. So as long as Byzantium stood, Severus couldn't conquer the east. Here, Niger would make his stand. Severus had to act fast. Although he controlled the capital, time was on Niger's side. If the people in Rome began to starve due to Egyptian grains not reaching the city, they would be quick to abandon Severus for an emperor who could fill their stomachs. Fortunately for Severus, the situation was not quite as dire as it would have been a century or more earlier. More of Rome's grain now came from North Africa than Egypt. But still, a reduction of supply to Rome of even 25% would have caused shortages and tensions. And Severus feared Niger would send a force overland from Egypt, past Libyan Cyrene, and up to Roman Africa in modern Tunisia. He strengthened the defenses in Africa to prevent any such attack on the rest of Rome's food supply. As Severus marched east, a lieutenant of his quickly arrived in the confines of Byzantium. Between the Black Sea and the Aegean is another small body of water called the Sea of Marmara. Byzantium is on this small sea, but so too was one of its neighbors, Perinthus. Like many Greek cities, the two neighbors were bitter rivals. When Byzantium went for Niger, Perinthus could only declare for Severus. When Niger reached Byzantium, he tried to capture Perinthus, but he was unsuccessful. That lieutenant of Severus arrived in time to throw back Niger's forces. This failure to secure the Sea of Marmara would prove to be fatal. As more of Severus's army arrived, his commander, Commodus, used Perinthus as a launching point to cross the sea and attack into Asia. Niger's general, Julianus, marched out to stop Commodus. Outside of Cyzicus, the site of Hadrian's greatest temple, if you remember back to the 130s, Commodus won for Severus an overwhelming victory over Julianus in the fall of 193. Severus now controlled a foothold on the Asian shore. That winter, Niger fled from Byzantium, regrouped with his allies just across the channel, and tried to dislodge Severus's forces. Outside Nicaea, the two sides met, and Severus's army again defeated Niger's. Pescennius Niger was forced to flee again, this time all the way to Syria. He had to abandon all of Anatolia and fall back behind the Taurus Mountains. Meanwhile, Severus put Byzantium under siege. The Nigerian forces, the forces of Niger attempted to defend the Cilician Gates, the narrow passes through the mountains to Syria. In May of 194, though, a Severan general broke through. Niger himself led his army out of Antioch to stop the incursion. The two sides met beside the Mediterranean Sea at Issus, the very spot Alexander the Great had defeated Darius III. The two armies faced each other on opposite sides of a wide plain that sloped slowly down from hills to the east and terminated by the sea on the west. Both sides set up camp and spent an anxious night awaiting battle. Come morning, the army of Severus and the army of Niger lined up. Severus's army advanced first. Niger's army fired volleys of arrows, and their javelin throwers pelted them. The Illyrian legions of Severus seem to have employed a modified testudo formation, with shields in front and above them as they advanced to protect themselves from missile fire. Meanwhile, Severus's cavalry succeeded in doing what the Persians of Alexander's day had failed to do at Issus, flanking the enemy. Niger's army was crushed between the legions and the cavalry. Unable to endure the pressure, the army of the east was routed. Thousands were slaughtered. Niger and his bodyguard managed to escape to Antioch, but with his army destroyed and the army of Severus advancing, he couldn't stay there. He left town in secret, but was spotted in the suburbs of town and beheaded by pursuing horsemen. So ended Pescennius Niger, the third emperor to die in the wake of Commodus. Back at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, the siege of Byzantium continued. The city was well defended. Hoping to lower morale, the head of Niger was placed on a pole in view of the city. But even with their champion dead, the defenders of the city held out. Their food supplies were slowly dwindling, however. Severus had left the siege to a lieutenant as he visited the cities of Syria, securing his position there. This lieutenant, who I won't bother naming to avoid throwing yet another name at you, kept up the siege for months. The defenders grew famished and desperate. In late 195, after 2.5 years, Byzantium surrendered. The army and leading politicians were executed, the baths and the theater of the city were torn down. Its fortifications were demolished. Even its status as a city was removed. It was now designated only as a village, under the jurisdiction of its hated rival, Perinthus. If we didn't know the future of this city, it would be easy to expect that this was the end of a great city being on that site. As I just mentioned, Severus himself wasn't present at the siege. He had gone east with an army and invaded the small kingdoms between Rome and Parthia, Osroene and Adiabene, and into northern Arabia. Dio says the short campaign was for his own glory, but it seems that these client kingdoms had supported Niger in his bid at the emperorship and taken the opportunity provided by Roman disunity to seize the frontier fortress town of Nisibis. Severus undertook a punitive campaign on Osroene and Adiabene and reoccupied Nisibis. The point was to regain the fortress, but also a bonus of this campaign was to integrate his Danubian legions and the legions of the east and iron out any ill will between the two. From here, he sent 3 generals out into Parthian territory where they raided and laid waste to the countryside. The emperor had ambitions of a great invasion into Parthia, but this wasn't the time for that. In celebration of his brief campaign in the eastern borderlands, he named his son Caesar. We call his eldest son Caracalla. In theory, the civil war was over. Severus had defeated Niger. But we can't forget about Albinus, the Caesar to Severus's Augustus. Coins printed up to this point had emphasized their unity. But this was only a mirage, a deception of Severus. Now that Niger was out of the picture, he dropped the facade. He had always planned on discarding Albinus as soon as he was secure. His alliance with the British governor was just to buy himself some security while he defeated Niger. When news of the elevation of Severus's son reached Britannia in the autumn of 196, the intentions were clear. Albinus was declared emperor by his loyal legions. Civil war resumed. Albinus had no real alternatives but rebellion, if you can call a reaction to betrayal rebellion. The only thing making Severus more legitimate than Albinus was his control of Rome. Sure, the Senate had backed him, but what choice did they have when he was surrounded by his Danubian legions? It had been under duress. Or at least they just preferred Severus over the terrible reign of Julianus. When it came down to it, many in the Senate preferred Albinus to Severus. These Albanians, no, again, that's not the right term, supporters of Albinus tried to keep their preference a secret. Severus had put on a good face when he entered Rome, but the cruelty behind his mask was apparent to those with eyes to see. Rather than defending Britannia, Albinus made the aggressive act of crossing the Channel with 40,000 men and invading Gaul. As he marched out to occupy the key cities of the area, he sent out overtures to the legions stationed along the Rhine River. But the governor of Germania Inferior, Virius Lupus, was an ally of Severus and he refused to join the rebellion. Albinus would not have to fight totally alone, however. The governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, the province covering northern Spain, brought his legion across the Pyrenees and threw his support behind Albinus. Albinus made Lugdunum, modern Lyon, France, his base. This was the largest city of Gaul at the time. As Severus began the long march back west, Albinus took the initiative and attacked into Germania Inferior, hoping to either neutralize the legions there or convince them to join him. He defeated Virius Lupus and his army in battle, but not so decisively that they would join him. Albinus considered invading Italy, but Severus had fortified the Alpine passes prior to his campaign in the east. Meanwhile, Severus crossed back into Europe, past the fresh rubble of Byzantium and journeyed along the border through Thrace, Moesia, Pannonia, Noricum, and Raetia. He pressed his soldiers onward without rest days, often walking with the column bareheaded through snow and rain, setting an example for his men. He finally crossed through the mountains and entered Gaul proper. A showdown was coming. Severus made for Lugdunum from the north. Reports of the size of Albinus' army shocked him. He had expected to have an advantage in numbers, but the two sides were nearly evenly matched. Their first confrontation took place about 60 miles north of Lugdunum. Severus was able to drive off his enemy, but Albinus managed an orderly retreat. They fell back to Lugdunum and prepared for an ultimate confrontation. That final battle began on February 19th, 197. The Battle of Lugdunum between the army of Severus and the army of Albinus was the largest battle of Roman history. Yeah, you heard that right. 150,000 soldiers were involved. More than when the Romans fought Hannibal at Cannae, more than when Augustus defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium. The bloodiness of the battle lived up to its size. Both sides were nearly evenly matched, with Severus having perhaps a small advantage in numbers. The two armies lined up, and the Battle of Lugdunum began. Cassius Dio and Herodian give slightly different versions of what happened. The battle swung back and forth several times. Each side's right wing found success. The Danubian legions, loyal to Severus, pushed back Albinus' infantry until it had fallen back almost to the camp before they were able to rally. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the field, Albinus' right wing had hidden a trench in front of their lines. Several rows of the Severan army on this side fell into the hole before the advance could stop, throwing them into chaos. Severus himself had not taken part in any of the battles against Niger, but here he was active, leading his soldiers from his horse and rallying their morale. At one point, in the thick of the fighting, his horse was cut from under him, and he fell onto the blood-soaked dirt. He managed to avoid being slain, however. The battle continued on for at least a full day, unusually long and grueling for a pitched battle. With both sides reaching exhaustion, a lieutenant of Severus, who had either been held in reserve or was late to arrive, sent in his soldiers. These fresh men were able to swing the battle in Severus' favor, and soon the morale of Albinus' men crumbled. Streams of men broke and ran for the safety of Lugdunum. Albinus was among them. To make a brutal story short, Severus' army was able to enter the city and began a horrific rampage. Albinus took his own life. Lugdunum was sacked and burned. The premier city of Gaul was destroyed, and it never really recovered. The body of Albinus was separated from its head. The body was thrown into the Rhone River. The head was sent to Rome to warn off would-be usurpers. Finally, one emperor stood alone at the top of the Roman world, Septimius Severus. But his victory had come at a great cost. The plain outside Lugdunum was strewn with thousands of Roman dead. The strength of the legions bled out on the soil. Even among the victors, there was consternation at the cost of Severus' victory. And for what? The choice of one emperor over another? The victorious emperor soon returned to Rome and no longer hid his cruelty. 29 senators who supported or were accused of supporting Albinus were executed. The rest of the Senate might have protested. What made Severus any more legitimate than Albinus? But the answer was clear now. ultimate legitimacy came through military strength. This secret had been hidden since Augustus to maintain the facade of republicanism and senatorial authority. Occasionally, an emperor had let the curtain drop before, but Severus was neither interested in maintaining appearances with the Senate, nor would he place himself in a situation where senatorial schemes could touch him. His rule rested plainly and openly on military dictatorship. Part 4. Rule by the sword, conquer by the sword. After executing the supporters of Albinus, he shocked all by demanding divine honors be granted to Commodus. When the Senate gave some feeble pushback, Severus tied himself to his dead predecessor by claiming he too was a son of Marcus Aurelius, and thus a brother of Commodus. The cowed Senate acquiesced immediately. All put on a good face and attempted to appear to side with Severus, but this was only out of fear. Dio, who was among the Senate, says they often slipped up when presented with new information, and their real feelings were apparent. Fortunately for the Senate, Severus's return to the capital would be brief. His previous time in Rome had been short up to now, just a month in the capital after displacing Didius Julianus, before he had gone to stamp out Niger. The intervening 4 years between then and early 197 had been spent in civil war, first in the east and then in Gaul. This day would not be much longer. Severus soon took his army and headed back toward the east. The Parthians were his target. They had taken advantage of the last phase of the civil war, when several legions were pulled away from the east to march to Gaul, to assert themselves in contested territory. They had recaptured some of Mesopotamia that Rome had claimed, and were threatening to take more. Severus sailed from the port of Brundisium near the heel of the boot of Italy and made for Cilicia. From there, he crossed overland all the way to Nisibis, where his general, Latus, had successfully fended off a Parthian attempt to capture the fortress town. From here, Severus led out an invasion of Parthia. Our details of this war are slim. There don't seem to have been any pitched battles between the two sides. The tactics the Parthians had used to defeat Crassus and Mark Antony 200 years earlier were no longer effective. By now, after defeat during Trajan's and Marcus Aurelius' reign, they knew better than to fight the Romans on an even playing field. The Parthian army retreated before the advance of the legions. Boats were built using the abundant woods of northern Mesopotamia and floated on the Euphrates River. Now, with efficient supply lines, Severus and his army advanced down the river, paralleled by the supply boats. Each town they came to surrendered. No army was in sight. Finally, Severus's army reached Seleucia, or what remained of it. The city was surely a shell of its former self, 30 years after its sacking during the time of Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. They took control of what was there and passed east across the Tigris. Here was Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital. Like so many times before, the Romans took the city without a fight. In their last expedition here, the legions had been kept from ransacking, but this time Severus allowed the city to be looted. Dio says thousands were slaughtered and more were carried off as captives to be sold into slavery. After a brief stay, the army turned back north and moved alongside the Tigris River, back toward home turf. On their way, they took a detour. Deep in the desert was a great fortress city called Hatra. When Trajan had conquered into Mesopotamia in 117, this had been the lone holdout. Though he had besieged it due to supply issues, the strong defenses, the heat of the desert, and the revolts taking place elsewhere, he had been unable to capture it. Severus now attempted to one-up Trajan and take Hatra. To make a long siege short, though, the Romans failed to take the city and suffered great losses. Severus pulled back, regrouped with better supplies and better siege weapons, and tried a second time to take it. Again, they failed to dislodge the Parthian garrison. The foraging parties were constantly harassed by Arabian horsemen. When a section of wall was broken, supposedly Severus angered his Danubian legions by holding off their breaching through the gap until the next day, by which time the wall had been patched back up. These legions refused to advance when ordered the next day. The Syrian legions were sent in their place against the wall, and there they suffered severe casualties. Hungry, hot, and tired, morale cratered. Severus's cruelty or jealousy didn't help matters. Around this time, he put to death his lieutenant Latus after hearing that his soldiers loved him and wouldn't go into a campaign unless Latus led them. After failing to quickly dislodge the defenders of Hatra, Severus withdrew. He traveled over to Palestine and then went down to Egypt. He toured the province and sailed up the Nile as far as the border with Ethiopia. We will leave him here in the last months of the 2nd century. A quick note on his campaigns in Parthia, though. The northern half of Mesopotamia was annexed, and the southern portion down to the Persian Gulf, though independent, was under the sway and influence of Rome. The new territory between the rivers could never be secure, though. Hatra remained a thorn in the Romans' defenses. Part 5. Who was Severus? See, I told you this was going to be a long episode. We've been so busy with the action, we've not had a moment to really get to know this Septimius Severus. We'll start with biography, then get to some reforms he made between campaigns. Lucius Septimius Severus was born in April of the year 145 in Leptis Magna in the province of Africa. This city was in modern Libya. The province of Roman Africa itself covered eastern Algeria, Tunisia, and western Libya. Severus's ancestry was mixed. His father came from a Punic, meaning Carthaginian, and Libyan Berber background. His mother's side had Italian origins and were part of the Fulvi gens. Cassius Dio describes him as a Libyan by race. He probably spoke Punic among his family, but Latin was the dominant language of Roman Africa, as opposed to the Greek of Egypt and the East. Other emperors had come from the provinces by this point. Trajan had been from Hispania. Septimius, though, was the first emperor to be both from the provinces and of provincial origin. Poetically, in Severus, Carthage had conquered Rome. His father held no prominent political positions, but he had several relatives who had made a name for themselves in Rome. 2 cousins were consuls during Antoninus Pius's reign. Severus decided to follow their path, and on a relative's recommendation, he had been admitted to the senatorial ranks. At this time, there were many men from the province of Africa that were rising in the political ranks. It seems they formed networks of mutual support. They had cliques that favored others from their same background. We don't need to give every detail of his rise, but in general, his trajectory was up. In 166, however, the Antonine Plague hit Rome and threw a roadblock in his path. To escape the miasma of plague in the city, he returned home to Leptis Magna. He stayed here for 3 years. Returning to Rome in 169, he found the obstacle of the plague had affected others worse than him. With many senators dead, the road was open for competent officials to rise quickly. In 175, he married Passia Marciana, who was also a native of Leptis Magna. Their marriage lasted until 186 when Patia died. The couple had no children. Severus quickly sought a new marriage. One account tells us that he consulted a horoscope for a future wife, and the results suggested someone from Syria. When he began inquiring, he found an eligible bachelorette in Julia Domna, a descendant of an old royal line from Emesa. Her father, Julius Bassianus, was a priest for the local manifestation of the sun god called Elagabal. Julia was foretold to marry a king someday, so naturally Severus was interested. She and her family will play an important role in Roman politics for the next several decades. A marriage was proposed and agreed upon. In 187, the two married, not in Syria, but in Lugdunum in Gaul, where Severus was a legate. This gives you a quick taste of how cosmopolitan and interconnected the Roman world was, and still was in the late 2nd century. A man from modern Libya marries a daughter of a Syrian noble in modern France. Sounds pretty normal in today's connected world, but pretty unusual for the 1800 years or so between. Anyway, the two married and quickly had two sons, Bassianus in 188 and Geta in 189. Shortly after his marriage, he became the governor of Pannonia. Then in 190, he returned to Rome and served as consul. And then in 191, Severus was recommended to serve as governor of Pannonia by Laetus, not the general who he had assassinated, but the Laetus who was the Praetorian Guard who conspired with Marcia to kill Commodus. And that finally places him in Pannonia, back where we found him at the opening of this episode. I mentioned earlier that Severus was part of a clique of rising politicians from the province of Africa. He used those connections to his advantage to reach the Principate, but as princeps, he came down harshly on his fellow Africans. Albinus was also from Africa, and we saw how Severus betrayed him and showed him no mercy. Then, when he returned to Rome, a majority of the senators he had executed were from Africa. Their significant rich properties were seized and folded into the imperial holdings. Since his accession, we have seen how he marched on Rome, displaced Julianus, went east to wipe out Niger, turned west and eliminated Albinus, before going east again, this time to invade Parthia. It had been a busy few years for Severus. During these constant movements, though, he made several significant reforms, just about all of them having to do with the military. First, Severus raised soldiers' pay by 1/3. This increased recruitment as well as the loyalty of the soldiers to Severus. He also formally legalized marriages during service. He created 3 new legions as well, Legio Parthica 1, 2, and 3. These were raised to go to war in Parthia, hence their name. Significantly though, Legio II Parthica was not stationed in the provinces, but in Italy itself, just 20 miles from Rome. Now, besides the Praetorians, Severus controlled a legion in the Senate's backyard, a sword of Damocles hanging over the head of any potential usurper. The addition of these 3 legions brought the total count to 33, the highest yet since Augustus's day. This expanded and better paid military was expensive. Although he had only increased the legion count from 30 to 33, Rome was now spending as if he had increased the number to about 45 legions, an increase in spending of about 50%. The military was already the largest expense in the budget. The treasury already couldn't keep up with expenses. So, how did Severus pay for this bigger army? He made each coin worth less. He debased the currency, even beyond what Commodus had done. Under Commodus, the silver percentage had fallen below 75%. Pertinax had spent some of his limited political capital raising it back up, briefly. But Severus, by the end of his reign, reduced the silver percentage down to 54%. So really, his better paid soldiers had more coins, but no more value. And as maybe you're tired of me saying almost every episode, inflation sprang higher. We have seen several instances now of Severus flaunting precedent or tradition, with taking his soldiers into Rome with him on the first appearance after Commodus's death, to stationing legions in Italy, to promising not to put senators to death without the Senate's approval, then executing dozens of them after his return from defeating Albinus. Notice, too, that he had no hesitation about appointing his own son as his heir. He did it while on campaign in the East, not in Rome. His soldiers acclaimed Caracalla as Caesar. The Senate had no say in the matter. Septimius Severus was many things, ruthless and dictatorial, but also efficient and judicious. Ironically, while he flaunted tradition, his reign also saw important legal reforms, and his appointees did much to develop legal philosophy which our law codes are still built upon. But that will have to wait for next time. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying 202 Decades, it would mean a lot to me if you could take a moment and leave a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This really helps new listeners find the series. And don't forget that this is your last reminder to send in questions about the past century. You can submit those questions either on Patreon or by email to 202decades@gmail.com. We're going to pause the narrative for a couple of episodes here and recap the past 10 decades and look at larger trends that we've not noticed while zoomed in so close to the action. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time. Send in your questions.